everyone, welcome to the community classroom. This is Dr. Tracey McCarthy, psychologist, attorney, and educator, and we're going to be continuing our discussion on Nordicism, and we have some visual aids to help us out with this discussion and this understanding so that you can see how Nordicism pairs with the issue of colorism and also this issue related to just phenotype overall. And we're going to look at the issue of what's considered proxy by proximity in terms of Nordicism, and we're also going to wrap up with a discussion about how Nordicism has impacted the treatment of Native American Indians and how Nordicism plays a role in issues related to interracial dating, what some people refer to as swirling. And so we're going to touch on all of that, and we're going to do it pretty efficiently. Now, as you can recall, Nordicism is about having a particular phenotype, which is basically very light skin in terms of color, very light eyes or blue eyes, and very light hair. And that light hair is generally blonde, not sort of ash blonde or strawberry blonde, but very blonde. Very thin features, thin facial structure, and a slender body shape. And so what we're going to look at first is how Nordicism looks and how it plays out when looking at people from different backgrounds in relation to someone who has a Nordic background. And remember, Nordicism comes with this perception or this belief that there are certain personality characteristics that accompany this physical makeup. And then the extension of that is the closer you are to Nordic, the more likely you are, according to this paradigm, to possess these traits. And so there's the belief or the assertion that individuals who are closer to Nordic have these traits, and that they are also, thinking like Benjamin Franklin, they are also presumably entitled to receive greater amounts of privilege and greater amounts of esteem and access. Okay, so as you can see at the top left-hand corner, there's an individual male who basically has pretty stereotypical Nordic features. And these other men on the screen are men from Africa and different parts of Africa. And so what you are looking at is sort of these gradations in relation to proximity to Nordicism. Now, it's not clear cut because proximity to Nordicism varies, because it could be you're looking at facial features, it could be hair texture, hair color, eye color, it could be all of those things. And so it's not just this straight trajectory when you're talking about this issue of Nordicism and this issue of privilege that tends to be afforded people based upon proximity to Nordicism. And so you can see that the first individual, although looking ambiguous in terms of racial classification, is probably the closest to the individual who manifests the Nordic features. And so that individual, by proximity, would be in receipt of more privilege, social esteem, social power, things like that, in relation to the other people on the screen. And so what happens in this Nordicism paradigm and in the colorism paradigm and the paradigm related to phenotype is that individuals who are in the middle between the person who is Nordic up in the top left-hand corner and the person who is darker African in the lower right-hand corner, the dance that is done is between the people that are in the middle, and the people in the middle are the ones primarily who are vying for or jockeying for a position, and say that so they would tend to jockey for a position or jockey to receive the privileges that they believe are attendant to being Nordic. And so based upon their proximity to Nordicism, or the person who is Nordic, based upon that proximity, they would receive, presumably, privileges. And so it just depends on how that proximity is determined, from situation to situation. But for the most part on the screen, the first three people would be the most likely to receive what you would consider Nordic privilege by proxy, based upon this proxy identification of white. Even though they are not clearly white, they would tend to be classified as white. And when you come to the United States, what many people find is that even individuals who would not be stereotypically considered white by proxy, they also may take on that identity. So you might find that actually all five of the first individuals might readily identify as white as a construct in the United States, regardless of skin color. And so the more different a person looks in terms of, or in contrast to, a Nordic individual, presumably the less privilege they might receive. And so they could perhaps have lighter skin color, but their features might be fuller in terms of their facial features. And those fuller facial features might push them further away from that Nordic identity. And so even with the lighter skin, the facial features themselves, the phenotype, might create some distance there. So again, you would have that jockeying for position that you see people exercising. And so, you can look across the screen and see the different ways, and you do a comparison and contrast. How does the individual compare and how do they contrast with the Nordic identity? And that is the way these systems that we have co-created have been set up to privilege certain people based upon phenotype. And there are also some people who subscribe to this idea of individuals, falling in line with Noah's sons. And so you would have, one of the three sons, individuals would identify or be descendants of one of those three sons. And that identification also has implications for proximity to Nordicism and proximity to that Nordic identity. Okay, and now you can see the same dynamic using continental African women. And so you can see across the screen where you have the first three individuals generally would be identifying as white. Now, of course, the first individual, top right, left-hand corner, is considered the standard white. And the other two individuals, though they are not Nordic and they would not be considered, again, under Benjamin Franklin's paradigm, they would not be considered the standard white or the pure white, or in his estimation, they are not white enough to be classified as white. But one of the things that is done, particularly in the United States, where people give up ethnicity in order to put themselves under that race umbrella. If you ever look at the census is very interesting because white never changes on the census. And so it benefits people to give up, being Polish and Czechoslovakian and Croatian and Russian, it benefits them, or being North African, it benefits them to simply identify as white versus an actual ethnicity. And for that reason, a lot of people who identify as white, they really have lost a lot of their ethnic identity in terms of another home base outside of America, in terms of that culture. And so as you go along, you can see where privilege and esteem and promotion would be attached to the women on the screen based upon their proximity to the Nordic, purported Nordic ideal, which is in the upper left-hand corner. And so, and it can vary because, again, it's not just about skin color. It's about things like hair texture and eye shape and, facial structure and things like that. And so all of those things will come into play when this game of colorism and Nordicism and phenotype discrimination takes place in social situations. And again, just like with the men, with the women, it's not the Nordic individual who's even a part of the dynamic. The majority of people on the planet are not Nordic. The majority of people on the planet are past Nordic. They are not the standard white. So they have some variation of brown or black hair and darker eyes and darker skin. And so what's happening though is that with men and women, there is this game that is played where individuals often get their low self-esteem boosted by attempting to position themselves in one way or another in closer proximity to the Nordic ideal, which is manifested on the screen. And also with females versus males, there's a tendency to add something to that Nordic dynamic where femininity is attached to Nordicism for females. So the closer one is understood as being closer to a Nordic female, then there is a paradigm in place that attempts to suggest that one's femininity is graded based upon that proximity to the Nordic female ideal. It doesn't quite work that way for males. And so there may be a lack of empathy when males and females who are on this sort of spectrum, when they engage in discussions about how Nordicism may impact males and females. In fact, it goes in the opposite direction. Okay, now we get to look at this dynamic of Nordicism in a very interesting way, because all of the people on the screen are presumably white. Okay, and so even though you see a large range there, because of the racial classifications that exist in the world, where you have Negroid, Caucasoid, and Mongoloid, individuals are pretty much forced to identify with one of those three. And in identifying with one of those three, the individuals on the screen are generally going to identify with Caucasoid. So they're going to generally identify as white. And so even with those who identify as white, there is a serious game of colorism that goes on. And so on the screen, as you can see, there is quite a variety here. And those who are closest to the Nordic ideal are more likely to receive privilege by proxy that is a closer approximation to what someone who is Nordic might receive. So that would be the first two over. And then it theoretically starts to decrease the further you go to the right. Now, sometimes it's on an unconscious level, but oftentimes it's on a conscious level that the individuals on the screen are very clear that they are not Nordic and that they are not considered the standard or the ideal. And sometimes there is, of course, low self-esteem that sort of creeps in for many individuals, and they may even overplay this idea of whiteness. And they might want to overemphasize this presumed identity of whiteness in order to give themselves sort of a leg up in relation to other people who actually, for some of them on the screen, may actually even be lighter than them. But they don't fit in that classification of Caucasian. But the individuals on the screen, past Nordic, do recognize, collectively recognize, now individuals might not recognize, but they do understand in this system of white, pure white, being the standard. They do understand that they do not represent the standard, but what they often do is access privilege by proxy and by proximity. And people tend to be very much aware of that. And of course, people are not prone to, throw privilege back if someone wants to give it to them. Now, of course, in order to make this work, you have to have people who are further along in terms of the color spectrum. You have to have them go along with this idea and affirm the individuals on the screen and go along with this idea that all of the people on the screen are white and that all of the people on the screen are somehow supreme in terms of the proximity test. Okay, and now what we have is an example of the relationship between Nordicism and Nordic identity and Asian identity. So, and also Australoid identity in some instances. So what you can see here is how this also plays out with individuals who have Asian in terms of a part of their ethnicity. And so again, the closer an individual is to that Nordic ideal, the more likely they are to receive privilege by proxy related to Nordic identity. So of course, the first ones, the male and female top and bottom in the first screen, right next to the two individuals who have the Nordic features, those are the ones who are going to, in the Asian world, receive the highest degree of privilege by proxy and proximity. And so other individuals, the more quote unquote Asian their features appear, or the darker their skin appears, or the darker their hair appears, the more they are less likely to be perceived as white and to receive that privilege by proxy. And so even in the Asian world, there is this vying and jockeying for position in terms of receiving privilege by proxy, in terms of being related to Nordic individuals. And you will see individuals who have Asian backgrounds, depending on the culture, you might see them with umbrellas frequently. And the reason for the umbrella is because they do not want to get any darker. And so if they can preclude getting darker, then it's easier to maintain that proximity to the Nordic identity. And so for Asians, the focus does tend to be on the skin color, because the hair is generally dark and the facial features are going to be very specific, and they're not going to be Nordic looking features. In fact, many Asians, regardless of their skin color, tend to have features that look a little bit more what would be considered Negroid features. And so you'll also notice with a number of individuals who are continental African, their features also look very Asian often. And so if you look at the west coast of Africa, there's often you'll notice a lot of Asian features in individuals, and also with the San, their features are very Asian looking, very Asiatic. And then here we have island individuals, and you can see the same dynamic going on. Now, there's a little back and forth. You might notice it's like, wow, you see people of different shades in different places, and you might automatically think that one group should, go in one direction or the other. But what happens is that there's still that issue of that proximity to whiteness. And so the individuals who at this point look more Asian, those are the individuals that have that closer proximity in terms of island individuals. And then you're also looking at, when you get to the end, you get over to the right hand side, even though the individuals at the very end are lighter than the ones that are next to them, the ones that are next to them have facial features, phenotype that looks more consistent with the Nordic phenotype. And so the main difference really for those individuals is the skin color. Even the hair, as you notice, their hair is lighter than all of the other individuals. So they have the facial phenotype that's closer to Nordic, and their hair color is also closer to the Nordic hair color, along with the individuals at the end who also have much lighter hair. Okay, now we get to the good stuff. Okay, now this screen, what you see is a spectrum in terms of individuals who are biracial. Now this is going to be an interesting screen along with the screen that's coming up next, because you're going to get to see how colorism starts to really play a role in some dynamics. So you've got all of these individuals who have basically a biracial identity. And I also, if you notice, I put two different selections of two individuals, two couples. They're not real couples, but two entities up there, so that you can see how their racial identity and their proximity to Nordicism changes with perhaps sun exposure, and for Colin Kaepernick, basically exposing hair. And so his hair is the thing that gives him away. If his hair is cut short and he's not in the sun, as you can see, two spaces over, he actually looks a little closer to Nordic. And so you have the first two individuals that look as close to Nordic as possible in terms of the individuals. So they have lighter skin and lighter hair. However, the features, Meghan Markle's features, might look more Nordic than the other individual. Now, one of the things that you might notice is that even though the first two individuals are very light, they have fuller lips. And so their features are a little bit more full than the standard Nordic features. And you can see all of the individuals on the screen are presumably biracial. However, they look different. All of them look different. And so you can see the different manifestations. As you get towards the end, the individuals in the last two columns, basically, they will not generally be perceived as biracial just at first glance. And so they would perhaps receive more privilege by proxy in terms of closeness to Nordicism based upon skin color in a colorism paradigm. However, the standard experience that many of them would probably have, were they not actually professionals, Hollywood professionals, the experiences that they would have would be the experiences in terms of how the world would treat them as sort of lighter skinned black people or lighter skinned brown people. Now, one of the things that you need to make note of when you're talking about biracial individuals are able to access a different kind of privilege by proxy. So they're able to access sort of this direct privilege by proxy just by having the perception, having them be perceived as biracial or being perceived as lighter, but they also, particularly depending on the parent too, they also have access to privilege, sort of white types of privilege by proxy based upon the parent giving them that indirect privilege by proxy. And if they have a parent who has Nordic features, a Nordic parent, they're going to have even greater access to the possibilities of privilege versus if they have two parents who are stereotypically considered white, but they do not have Nordic features. Now, one of the fascinating things about the biracial dynamic is that some biracial individuals are actually darker than and have more non-Nordic looking features than some individuals who are considered brown Americans, black Americans, African Americans, indigenous black Americans. And so I know there's some discussion about, you know, whether or not biracial people can play on the quote unquote team of, you know, both sides there. But it's really interesting because in some instances you have some biracial individuals who look presumably whiter than other people who are identifying themselves as white, where they look blacker than other individuals who are identifying themselves as black. And so it's an interesting dynamic when people start thinking that they can define other people and classify people and determine what someone's cultural inheritance is going to be based upon having parents who are perceived as more white or more black. Okay, so we used celebrities for this one just to make sure that there weren't any individuals who were outwardly identifying as biracial. And so even with individuals who are not identifying as biracial, you can see that in the first three over from the individuals who have the Nordic features, those first three rows are individuals who are either lighter than or the same color as the individuals on the other one, who other slides where they were biracial. And so when individuals start doing all of this, you know, biracials can't be on the team, they have to be on the other team, or they need to have their own team. The question becomes, how do you determine who goes on what team? How do you look at someone and determine who goes on what team? And the same thing works for individuals who identify as white nationalists. You know, they start talking about separating themselves out and having their own space. And the question for them also is, how do you operationalize this thing called whiteness? As you saw on the first screen, it's not very easy, and the identity of whiteness is very broad. And usually, again, it's not the individuals who are the Nordic individuals who are running those trains. They are individuals who are not Nordic who are trying to run that train, and they do not have solid cutoffs for anything. So, you know, there's no identifier in terms of what, you know, what are the features that the person has to have? What's the hair color? What's the skin color? What's the nose shape? What are the lips? What do the lips need to look like? What does the body need to look like? They don't have those things. This is why white nationalism, pure white nationalism, will never work. It's the same reason why pure Black nationalism will never work. If you do not have an operational definition of this thing called whiteness and blackness, it cannot easily work. And unless, of course, you're going to just do these arbitrary classifications on a case-by-case basis. But when you have individuals who are identifying as all of these different categories, and there is just no clear-cut way of understanding what category someone goes in, it's going to be very difficult for people to pull off all of these fantasy ideas about, you know, separating out and having their own space. Even if you look at the monarchs in the Nordic countries, Most of those monarchs in those Nordic countries, interestingly, look like they have Arabic backgrounds, or they have Hispanic backgrounds, meaning basically they've got a few drops. So they've gone past what would be considered the one drop rule. They have dark hair, they have olive skin. And so even in those situations, those individuals who are considered quote unquote Nordic, their racial classification is not clear cut. It's not that blonde hair, blue eyed sort of dynamic. And so it's not clear. And on the flip side of that, individuals who are wanting to keep biracial people out of both folds, so to speak, those individuals are operating from some spaces of challenges with self-esteem, in terms of needing to exclude and include based upon their own determinations of who should and should not fit. This is why the issue of lineage and ancestry is pretty much the most important thing, because you can have someone who looks stereotypically white and they can have a stereotypically black grandparent. You can have someone who looks stereotypically black and they have a stereotypically white grandparent. And so it's not as clear cut as it seems in terms of people thinking they're going to make up these teams based upon this. Okay, we're going to quickly touch on the issue of swirling. One of the things that you probably noted in the past screen there is that when the males and females were paired in terms of phenotype, in terms of skin color, they looked like two sides of the same coin. And they pretty much do. They look like, when you think about a couple, a pair, a match, there are similarities. And one of the things that happens when people are involved in cross-racial, cross-cultural dating situations and marriage situations, people often respond. They're responding to that sort of lack of symmetry. They're responding to that difference. And I know there are lots of people who have negative reactions to it. And some of that is based upon this idea of self-preservation and seeing themselves in the individual. So you might have individuals who identify as white, and if they see a white male with a female that looks like the females on the screen, to varying degrees, they may feel like when they see this, that somehow these relationships are endangering their survival in terms of their racial identity, in terms of their ethnic identity. The same thing would happen perhaps for males who would see females with men who look like the man on the screen. They might feel like there is an issue of survival being threatened in terms of being whited out, just like white people who identify as white might feel like they're being browned out. Now, it would be naive to overlook the issue of power in these biracial or multiracial or cross-racial relationships, because again, you have the dynamic of Nordicism going on. That's a sort of a global paradigm, people have bought into, and not just bought into, but actually perpetuate. And it's not, just the Nordic individuals that are a part of this. And so the people who consider themselves oppressed by that process are really keeping that train running. But one of the dynamics that goes on in these situations is that there is the power dynamic that goes on. And so when you have an individual who's Nordic with someone who is non-Nordic, there's a power dynamic that is there simply because of the way society is structured. And when you have the male-female dynamic going on, you have sort of a superpower imbalance. And so there are some dynamics that go on with that. Individuals who marry and who date cross-racially or cross in terms of phenotype, because a person can be classified as white but still be dating a cross phenotype. Sometimes there is the issue of them receiving privilege, again, by proxy through the partner. And for the partner, there may be a dynamic of getting an extra power boost by being in a relationship with someone who has less social power, less social capital. Now, of course, that may not always be the situation, and every situation is going to be different. However, because we co-create this social system that we're in, it's not something that can be completely avoided, even if the individuals are saying that it's not a part of their relationship paradigm. And here you would have the same dynamic in terms of cross-racial dating or marriage when you have a female who is Nordic or stereotypically considered white, and with males who are not Nordic or not considered stereotypically white or considered brown, or in this case island and Asian. And so one of the things that you have in this situation is people will respond in the same way. There will be often the perception, the external perception, that these pairings are resulting in sort of the extinction of their cultural group, their racial group. They may feel like they're being browned out or they're being whited out. And so that is a reaction, a dynamic that goes on in a culture that is based on Nordicism, whether the Nordicism is conscious or unconscious. And as with the males in relation to the females, you also have the dynamic in terms of Nordic or stereotypically classified as white females with non-white males. In those situations, you also can have a power dynamic that is going on. If it's a female who feels particularly disempowered with stereotypically white males, this may be an opportunity to recoup some of that power in a situation with a male who does not stereotypically have the same level of social capital and social power. And so, but you also have a dynamic where the individual males still have some of that male privilege that they might be able to access. So someone might be giving them male privilege even though they are not stereotypically white males. And so the power balances may be a little different. They would be a little different than with the white or Nordic male and the non-white, non-Nordic female. And as with the male with the females, with the female with the males, there is also that dynamic of, the individuals not being perceived as two sides of the same coin and looking, in terms of appearance as two different coins, not looking like a pair, not looking like a couple, not looking like, two birds, the same, two feathers on the same bird. And so that dynamic comes into play oftentimes when people are experiencing someone with someone who does not look like they share the same phenotype. Now, as we close, one of the things people need to be mindful of, because there is apparently a biracial, cross-racial, interracial dating and marriage push out there. There's a lot of advertisement for that. There's a lot of encouraging people to do that. People, have YouTube channels devoted solely to that dynamic. And everyone is free to do, of course, everyone knows that, free to do whatever they want to do. But sometimes, people do have to be mindful of why they might be following along with that. The advertisements are there for a reason. Advertisements are there to encourage behavior and also reward behavior. And so you still have to be careful, though, about taking in those media messages. Sometimes people turn what is exotic or different into, they start to eroticize it. But if the individual is not really interested in the individual as a whole person, then some of that tends to wear off after a period of time. And so the excitement may be gone after a period of time. So people do need to deal with each other as real human beings. And if individuals are dealing with each other in terms of very serious family relationships, in terms of trying to simply access power and privilege, then it's possible that they will likely have some difficulties that they might not have had otherwise. One of the most important things to take away from this is the fact that Nordicism exists, however, and colorism exists, but it requires individuals who understand themselves as oppressed by that process. It requires them to participate in the process to keep it going. In fact, those are the ones who do keep it going. And so individuals who are jockeying for position based upon their skin color, individuals who are putting people on a pedestal because they look racially ambiguous, those individuals often talk about feeling oppression, and those are often the very individuals who are fueling that dynamic. And so one of the things to be mindful of is if you hear someone who's just really, really, really going in on this issue, oftentimes it's sort of that thou doth protest too much. And so you do want to be mindful of that, because oftentimes individuals who go on and on about white supremacy or black supremacy, those individuals tend to be individuals who might be actually drawn to individuals that they're talking about the other people should not be drawn to. And so, just be cautious about where you get your information from and what you're doing with that information. And above all, remember that your true self-esteem, your value, your worth, your humanity is not tied to your proximity to anyone. You are inherently valuable and valued in and of yourself. And remember not to compare yourself with others. You are your own personal best. Remember, knowledge is power. Take care and see you soon. Oh, sorry about that. Before we go, we want to touch on the issue of this issue of Nordicism and its relationship to the treatment of Native American, Indian, indigenous individuals, aboriginals, originals of America. One of the things that happened with the determination of civilized tribes, the determination of trust tribes, the determination of who was going to keep their property, who was going to be enslaved. It was related to proximity to Nordicism. It was related to proximity to Nordic identity. And so those Indians who were given the benefit of identification as Indians were those individuals who had a closer proximity to quote unquote whiteness. And so believe it or not, the two individuals who are up at the top left hand corner, two over from the first individual, who is the Nordic female, those individuals are classified as Indian. And there was a practice where such individuals were able to access all sorts of resources that darker Indians who looked more in terms of phenotype like quote unquote African Americans or more like Africans, those individuals were less likely to receive the resources and receive the honor and respect due based upon this being their land. And so you can see across the screen the variety in terms of the manifestations of Indian identity and of Native American identity. And so again, the closer to Nordic an individual happened to be, the more likely they were to be able to hold on to their Indian, their native, their indigenous heritage without penalty. Individuals were penalized, people were punished, people were threatened, people were murdered, people were abused, their land was stolen from them simply because they identified as Indian. And so it was very easy to basically steal their identity from them. And so there are many ways that Nordicism rears its head, and ultimately it's not beneficial for anyone. It's not even beneficial for those individuals who identify as Nordic or those individuals who identify as stereotypically white. Remember, knowledge is power. Okay, take care and see you soon. Bye-bye.